Hi, and welcome to Designing a Water Filter. This is an assignment I've done from Module 2 as part of a graduate course at Millersville. So we're going to go through and we're going to see my process of actually going and creating a water filter. My first task was to figure out how am I going to establish a baseline for what my dirty water looks like. To do that, I decided to make a Sichi disc, which I had to do a little research for. So in making the Sichi disc, I cut it out of paper, and then I had to laminate it. The best that I could do was use packaging tape. So you can see me using packaging tape, covering it, trying to make it watertight so that I can use it not only in the beginning to establish the dirty water, but also at the end to establish how dirty is the water at the end. So from there, I also had to make it so that I could drop it in the water. Now, one of the challenges I ran into here is that it wasn't staying balanced, so I had to add little paper clips to balance out my Sichi disc. The great thing about Sichi disc is it has a white and black area on it that allows you to distinguish the Sichi disc from the rest of the water. So you can see I actually get it relatively balanced, and I'm going to use that to determine how dirty my water is when I start. So went outside, got a whole lot of dirt, threw it in a bucket, mixed it in with some water. You can see me, I'm actually taking the Sichi disc and pushing it down into the water to try to get a good idea of how dirty this water is. So when I established how much I could see about that much of the Sichi disc, which was about 2 centimeters. From there, I decided to look at how does the earth filter water. So I listed out each of the layers, did some research. Turns out topsoil is full of organic materials, whereas subsoil is not, it's inorganic. From there, I looked at my materials. I had charcoal, gravel, sand, and alum. Now charcoal and alum, I had no clue what those were or really what role they play in my filter. So I did some more research. Turns out charcoal is good at removing those carbon or organic materials, whereas alum is good at removing all the small particles, called colloidals, inside my liquid. Gravel would be good at removing large particles, whereas sand would be good at removing small particles. Now I had everything I needed to make my filter. Decided to start with removing the big particles and working my way to the small ones. Gravel down to alum. Now, I had a very small amount of material, so this is going to be important as I thought about constructing my filter. I decided to place coffee filters between the sand, the charcoal, and the alum. And then I decided to get to work, looking at what materials I'd have available. I had these weird M&M containers and some water bottles, some other jars. So I decided I'm going to start off with my water bottle. It's going to be the core of my filter. I decided to poke some holes in the bottom so that the water would be able to filter through. Next, I tried to design one of my filters to separate the sand from the charcoal. So I used this mesh, tried to cut it in several different shapes and sizes until I finally got one that was able to fit inside the container. I went ahead and put the sand in, but unfortunately this is where my first big failure came, as the sand went right through the filter. So, back to the drawing board. I decided now to try to use a coffee filter. Put that in, was able to pour the sand in, and that kept the sand separated from the bottle, which would keep it separated from the charcoal. From here I made the rest of my filter, where I put in the alum in the bottom, followed by charcoal, sand, and gravel in the top. Decided to test it out. Unfortunately, it led to failure, and the water was going everywhere and not through the filter as it should. Turns out it was getting jammed right there in the middle, where those paper coffee filters were. So, back to the drawing board. This time I put mesh in the tube on the very bottom, and that would be my filter, and I eliminated all the other paper filters. Decided to test it out with some clean water, as you can see here, and success! It was working. It's time for the real test with dirty water. As we began to pour the dirty water in through the top, I watched as the water passed through each of the separate layers of the filter. Success! The dirty water was being cleaned, and you can see it collecting in the bottom of the container there. So my final filter was gravel, paper filter, sand, charcoal, alum, cheesecloth in the very bottom to help clean out some of that charcoal dirty color that I was getting. Question was, how pure was it? So I used my Sichi disc in my final container of water. I lowered it in to try to get a measurement of how deep I could still see the disc. Turns out it was about 10 centimeters, which gave me about a 500% increase in the purity of my water.
So now that you've seen me go ahead and complete the lab, let's look at where this falls on the Inquiry Continuum. First, we're going to look to what extent was the learner tasked with asking meaningful scientific questions. For this, I selected the third one, closer to learner self-directed. Because while we were given the initial question of how to design a water filter, we had to ask a lot of our own questions after that, like what's the role of alum? What is alum? I had to ask that for myself. What role does charcoal play? Those questions we had to start asking for ourselves. What materials would we use to design the filter? From there, we look at the data that was collected. For this one, I selected the fourth one. Now, while we were tasked with finding water purity for evaluating that, how we did that was up to us. I created a CG disk. I had decided to use a CG disk to evaluate its purity. That was all decided by me, the learner. Next, what do I do with that data? I'm going to select the fourth one here. So the learner formulates explanations after summarizing evidence. It was really up to me to determine, did this effectively purify my water? I had data, but it was up to me to evaluate how it was pure. We weren't given any extra explanation from there. Next, I'm going to select that the learner independently examines other resources and forms and links to explanations. And this is one of the things that I found challenging, because it's really up to the learner to determine to what extent does it become learner self-directed and teacher guided. So I could do it just as the teacher described, or I can take it 3 steps farther. And for myself, going and doing extra research on what role alum played, what role charcoal played, I had to go out to the other resources. I had to find those links and gather more evidence. I had to look at how does a CG disk work. That was all information I gathered for myself. And last, I'm going to put learner coached in development of communication. So we were guided as to how we communicate this information, how we'd organize it, doing this video. And for that reason, it was a little bit more teacher guided. So on the whole, this activity was very learner self-directed. It gave a lot of opportunity for independence, for students to ask their own questions, draw their own conclusions, and really take ownership over this lesson. So with that, thank you for watching. Have a good day.